And one of the things I ask the guys sometimes, I tell them I've got guests coming on. What should I ask them? One of the guys asked a really great question, and I'm gonna ask it and then ask my version of it too. He said, "What does a dialectical retreat look like for the CRT folks? I.e., is there a way for them to save face? I'm trying to figure out a way to have an end game. And, if somebody doesn't have a face-saving way out of conflict, well, then that means the decision tree is going to have to go in one direction or another." James, is there a face-saving end to this conflict with the CRT folks and their vision for the future of America and their attack on all of the pillars of American exceptionalism, their destruction of the schools where we're supposed to teach patriotism, to respect the Republican government that we have, to respect the free market economy that we have, private property rights being one of the most important things that we have? They're against all of those things. Is there a face-saving way that leads to an outcome, an acceptable outcome for us? Or is this Ricky Tikki Tavi, we're the mongoose, and they're the cobra, and, well, you know how that goes.
Well, I mean, it's really hard to have a face-saving path out of "I want to destroy your country" from within. But that said, there are actually a number of them. They require, as all face-saving, I guess, does when it's at this scale, a little bit of eating crow, which maybe they're not too want to do. We have to bear in mind also, remember, that woke is the resurgence of a face-saving project out of the liberationists in the 60s, which was neo-Marxism, which was a face-saving project of the cultural Marxism disaster that went through Central Europe after Lukács and so on, like tried to destroy Hungary, which is a face-saving project of the failures of Marxism, which was a face-saving project off of the failures of the young Hegelian progressive movement that preceded it. And Hegel maybe isn't directly responsible for what those who followed him in their zeal did with his ideas. So we have to be cautious with that. There has to be a degree of crow eating, but there are some paths. It's very, very simple to say a number of different things. One, they could very easily say, as Chris remarked, well, we had some critiques. Those critiques attached to real problems. We were very invested in pursuing and continuing the noble work of the civil rights movement. We got caught up in something that wasn't the best way to do it. And we had the best of intentions and just got way out ahead of our skis. That's actually face-saving. It actually is. We got ahead of our skis on a project that has good intentions is face-saving. Another one is, I think, honestly, if you are just completely, if you want to read like critical race theory and read it to where it makes sense, the absolute simplest thing to do, and I don't mean to pick on anybody politically, this is also why I don't have a 501c3, is to just replace everywhere it says white people with white Democrats, and it usually works. It usually simplifies. So what had happened? What has happened is that the so-called white liberal contingent that always gets called out within their literature is in fact enacting a lot of the bad policies. They think that they're helping when they're not. But again, that's that same face-saving thing. So it's, we were attaching too broadly. We saw a real problem and we blamed too many people for it. We overgeneralized. That was a mistake, but it wasn't an intentional destroy your country kind of mistake. That's face-saving. So there are those kinds of roots, but there is still crow eating. You have to admit you went too far. You have to admit you got caught up in a cockamamie conspiracy theory that all white people exist to hold all other people down. That's the racial contract. That's part of their theory. It's a central idea. We got whipped up to the point where we were scapegoating by racial characteristic. I don't want to say by race because they scapegoat whiteness, not white technically, but they also say that there's no difference between being and doing where it comes to whiteness. All white people benefit from privileges that they cannot easily renounce. That's an exact quote from Barbara Applebaum. So there are face-saving ways, which are we got caught up in something that attached to reality, and then we went too far with it. Another possibility, and this actually ties in with the institutional changes Chris was just talking about, is to point out that, well, we were just following, and this is gross, but the incentives were there, and people got caught up following bad incentives that were created, bad jurisprudence. For example, disparate impact as proof of discrimination is a bad incentive structure that encourages people to manipulate that through civil rights law. So the civil rights law becomes perverted. That's another thing. The incentive structures were bad. People were just following the incentive structures where they were, and we should just drop blame and correct the incentive structures and move forward the best we can. That's a safe face-saving thing. But where I said that, woke is a dialectical it's a dialectical synthesis of postmodernism and neo-Marxism. And then neo-Marxism is a dialectical synthesis of cultural Marxism and Hegelianism. And cultural Marxism is a dialectical synthesis out of vulgar Marxism into the cultural realm. We don't want them to have a dialectical retreat. We want to stop the dialectical BS. And so I don't want to give them a dialectical retreat. I want to give them a retreat where they are not seen as necessarily evil, bad people who messed up. We did a big, giant experiment for 40 years, and it was a terrible, terrible idea. But the people who were involved had the best of intentions, and they just got caught up in something that went really badly awry. So let's back up, take a breath, reconvene, and do something different. That's what there is. There's no dialectical retreat here. Communism of all stripes needs to die. It will never work.
Excellent answer. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that? How do we come to a conclusion that doesn't involve total annihilation? Or is that really where we need to go? Ideologically.
Yeah. I mean, sure, of course. Yeah. I think, I think it's probably naive to expect that there would be a kind of full retreat, or that people would say, I've recognized the error in my ways. A lot of people are incentivized and paid, and their livelihoods are dependent on promoting this ideology. And you have even corporate DEI, according to a report that I just saw, is a $8 billion a year annual business. Are they going to ever say, well, kind of overt racism in the workplace seems to be on the decline. It's maybe time to start winding down the DEI department, maybe reducing the funding commensurate to the level of discrimination. Of course not. They're going to come up with more invisible and subconscious and subtle microaggressions, maybe going down to even the level of picoaggressions, or whatever the metric system guides us to. And so I think it's probably naive to think that they'll go in that direction. But I think James is right into saying that you need to give the majority of people the benefit of the doubt. I think most people who are bought into this, not the hardcore people or the really originators of these ideas, but most people are just saying, hey, this seems like a good thing. Some of the language resonates with me. Those people need to be educated, need to be exposed to kind of what these things really do in practice, and then gently guided back to something more constructive. And I think there's also, though, another dialectic that I'm particularly interested at play recently, that you have this actually kind of hilarious dialectic, darkly hilarious, where you have this ideology which is self-consciously presents itself as revolutionary. We need to abolish capitalism. We need to overthrow the constitutional regime. We need to have a totally new society, a total rupture, as Marcuse put it. But then it's, and anti-capitalism is core to that, right? That's always been the dream. And yet, in the dialectical fashion, it's been absorbed into corporate life through diversity, equity, and inclusion. And really, I think that the kind of beautiful thing is that the revolution against capitalism has been then digested by radical consulting firms and sold back to Fortune 100 companies as anti-racist commodities. So you have that idea that the revolution might not be televised, but the revolution will be commodified. I mean, it literally is sold in these repeatable PDFs that have very high profit margins because the cost of replicating a PDF in the digital age is so low. You have, this beautiful economic system. So anti-capitalism has now been absorbed into capitalism. Anti-Americanism has now been absorbed into America's public institutions. And I think that's bad, right? This is not a good outcome. But in a way, it shows the power of our institutions, that it can even absorb something that is ostensibly and at the surface level opposed to it. I think that in a weird way doesn't give me it's not a great thing, but it does give me some level of hope that this kind of BS ideology can really just be absorbed, commodified, softened, and relegated to the unproductive sectors of corporate life, the unproductive sectors of our economy and the public bureaucracies. And hopefully from there, then we can take the kind of policy effort and then kind of limit and reduce how much we fund these kind of destructive ideologies, and then reorient our public institutions towards commonly held principles, towards a common sensibility, and towards excellence, which I think we want excellence. We want excellent schools. We want excellent achievements. We want excellent firms. We want excellent results for our country. And I think that is ultimately the direction that we can go.
All subcultures go through a process by which they become commodified and co-opted by the dominant culture. I think we'll start getting a hint of that if you start hearing people say, well, I was woke before the corporations picked it up, right? Like hipster wokeism. Yes. Hipster wokeism would be a good sign of that happening. And you make a really excellent point, Chris. I mean, when your biggest corporations are flying the flag and talking the talk and walking the walk, it's not a subculture. It's not a revolution anymore. It is just part of it. And it will be interesting to see if the absorption digestion hypothesis will be enough to process it and expel it as waste eventually. I don't know about that. So in the meantime, we all have to keep on doing what we're doing.